Welcome to Justice Beyond the Bench, a podcast by the International Association of Women Judges. I'm Jane Charles Voltaire.
And I'm Amy Lewis. In this series, we spotlight women across the global justice sector who are leading efforts to advance gender equality, strengthen judicial systems, and champion inclusive leadership.
From courtrooms to communities, we'll hear powerful stories and unpack the strategies shaping women's leadership in law and the judiciary. It's time to go beyond the bench. She tried war crimes in Bosnia, reformed Philadelphia's DA office at 83 years old, and has shaped global justice for women. Today, we're honored to welcome Judge Carolyn Temin, a trailblazer in the legal field and a lifelong advocate for justice.
Judge Temin broke barriers as the first woman lawyer hired by the Defender Association of Philadelphia. She went on to become a homicide prosecutor and then spent 3 decades on the bench of the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas.
She was the first woman elected president of the Pennsylvania Conference of State Trial Judges and later served as an international judge in Bosnia and Herzegovina, presiding over war crimes and corruption cases. Her global work spans Serbia, Georgia, Honduras, Thailand, and Tunisia, supporting reform and expanding access to justice.
Judge Temin's impact has been recognized widely. She's received the Anne X. Alpern Award and remarkably returned to public service in 2018 at age 83 as the first Assistant District Attorney of Philadelphia under reformer Larry Krasner.
In addition, Judge Temin also served as the NAWJ president and currently sits on the IWJ Board of Managerial Trustees. Her leadership, advocacy for incarcerated women, and deep commitment to fairness continue to shape the legal landscape. We welcome Judge Temin to this episode in her honor, Conversations with Women Who've Shaped Justice.
Welcome, Judge Temin. We're so excited to have you here today. Let's go ahead and just start at the beginning. What first drew you to the bench? And was there a moment you knew that this was your calling?
Well, it's really strange. I graduated law school in 1958. And when I graduated law school in Philadelphia, there were no women law professors at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. There were no women judges on the courts in Philadelphia. And there were no women lawyers in any of the big law firms. As a matter of fact, when I went to law school, I had no idea if I would ever actually be able to work as a lawyer. So I certainly wasn't thinking then of being a judge. And it wasn't until much later in my career, after I had many years of experience as a trial lawyer, that it really became something that I thought would be realistic for me to pursue.
And what would you say are maybe some of the biggest challenges that you faced on your journey to the bench, and how did you navigate them?
Well, actually, the biggest challenge in my state is getting elected because we elect our judges. And it's a very political process. And I didn't have any contacts in the political world when I started out. So that was a big challenge to overcome. And I really didn't think I could. So I didn't really work on it. And just by happenstance, it turned out that a classmate of mine from law school became one of the most powerful people in the Philadelphia city administration. He wasn't a member of the administration, but he was the power behind the mayor. He was the brains behind the mayor. And I was able to ask him to help me become a judge, and he did. I learned a lot about politics. I actually ran twice because the first time I ran, I entered politics as an endorsed Democratic candidate, which is almost impossible to do. But because my friend was so powerful, he was able to get me a place on the endorsed ticket. And if you're an endorsed Democratic candidate in Philadelphia, you will win, hands down. For years now, the only way for Republicans to win elections is to be endorsed by the Democrats, which does happen from time to time. So I looked like I was entering politics in a very strong position, but I learned very quickly some very important lessons about politics, which is that the people at the top may have a lot of power, but they don't necessarily control the votes. And the votes are pretty much controlled by the people further down the line who are called the ward leaders, who are in charge of the various wards throughout the city. Because the reality of being a judge who has to be elected is that almost nobody knows who you are. It's a big city, and you run on a ticket where the top of the ticket is either the mayor or the district attorney. And nobody is interested in who the judges are, and very few people would recognize any of the names, and you don't really get a chance to do very much about campaigning, so that you rely on the ward leaders to recommend you to the voters, and, that's how you win elections in Philadelphia. So the first time I ran, I did not have enough ward leader support and I lost. And I thought my judicial career was over. But 2 years later, we have judicial elections every 2 years. I went to a meeting of a new committee that had been formed called the Committee to Elect Women Judges. This was at the beginning of the start of women lawyers realizing that they should organize and do something about getting more women on the bench. At that time in Philadelphia, we never had more than 5 women on a court that had 65 judges on it. They weren't always the same 5 women, but there were never more than 5. So I went to the meeting of this committee because I intended to support whoever was going to take the plunge and run for judge. But someone came up to me at the meeting and said to me, "Oh, naturally, you're going to run again." And I said, "Oh no, absolutely not. I made my try and I learned my lesson, and you know, it's very expensive, and I've had my chance." And this person said to me that I would be crazy if I didn't run again because I had a lot of support, that a lot of the people who hadn't supported me before now wanted to support me, which was kind of an interesting lesson to learn about local politics. That at different times, people have different reasons for doing what they do. And it turned out that when the people worked against me, it wasn't because they didn't like me, it was because they had another goal in mind, and now all these people wanted to support me. So I did run again, and this time, not only did I win the election, but there were 42 people running for 12 places, and 4 of us were women. And all 4 of us won because we were backed by the mayoral candidate and all the people who were backing him. And that's how I became a judge, and that more or less is what I had to overcome in order to get there.
That's incredible. That's incredible just even thinking about the number of women and we talk a lot about like networking, sponsorship, but not necessarily in the political realm because election of judges is, so unique and only in a handful of countries globally, but it's so fascinating to get the tea a little on how that came about for you.
Yes. So I didn't always want to be a judge. I meet young women now. I recently left the DA's office, but while I was there, I did recruiting, and I myself was responsible for hiring about 250 young lawyers. So I interviewed quite a lot of young lawyers, and I heard many young women say that they wanted to be a judge, and I was glad that that's something that now that young women can aspire to from the very start of their career.
I can only imagine. I mean, just talking about, law school and what the landscape looked like to your most recent experience and how much really progress has been made.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I was the only woman in my law school class.
Wow.
My class was divided into 2 sections. There was 1 woman in each section, but the woman who was in the other section became a psychiatrist. So I'm the only woman who graduated from my class who actually went into the field of law. It was a rather different time.
Yeah. No, certainly, certainly. And changing gears a little bit, from Philadelphia to your experience on international tribunals, like in Bosnia and Herzegovina and other countries. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that came to be as well? And
Yes,
uh,
it's very interesting. I should mention that in my career, I have had a lot of things happen that I never expected, and they just sort of fell down out of the blue, so to speak. And very often when I hear people lecturing the young lawyers, they tell them to plan their career out. They should do step 1 and then step 2 and step 3. But when I talk to young lawyers, I always tell them to leave room for the unexpected because I always wanted to do international law. And in fact, when I was in law school, my intention was to, after graduation, to go on to get a PhD in international politics and
Mm.
to go into the international realm as somebody who would work for the State Department or something, a job like that. And I was encouraged to do that by one of my law professors. But then it turned out I got married, and that kind of kept me in Philadelphia because I immediately had 2 children. So I was grounded, and I didn't get to do any more schooling in the international area. But it was always something I was interested in. I've always been interested in languages and in other cultures and other systems. So when the opportunity to be on an international court came along, I was very happy to take advantage of it. But the way it happened was quite unusual. I never sought it out. I never even tried to find out if there were opportunities to do that. I knew that after the war in Bosnia, an ad hoc tribunal had been formed called the ICTY, the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia, which it's known as the ICTY. And I knew that Patricia Wade, who was a member of both NAWJ and IAWJ and was a very prominent judge on the DC Court of Appeals, was the first American judge to be appointed to serve on that court. I didn't know of any other court having to do with the war that had taken place from 93 to 95 in Bosnia. But in 2004, in about June, while I was serving as president of the National Association of Women Judges, I received a letter from the High Representative of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The High Representative was the UN appointee who basically ran the country. The country had its usual elected officials, president, and so forth, but the High Representative had awesome authority that could override those elected officials. He could remove elected officials, among other things. And it turned out that the then High Representative, who was Lord Ashdown from Ireland, had decided to establish a countrywide court called the State Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina to try cases that for some reason or other were not going to be tried at The Hague by the ICTY. And a matter of fact, at that time, it was thought that the ICTY would sunset because that's what was provided in the rules and regulations of the court at that time. It turned out later that it did not sunset when it was first expected to, and it continued for many more years. But in the meantime, Lord Ashdown had established the State Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he established it as an international court that would be 50% national judges and 50% international judges. And then he solicited countries to second judges to serve on the court. And seconding is where you are paid by your own government to serve another government.
Okay.
So all the international judges on the state court were seconded. And the first two American judges to serve on that court were from Minnesota. They were two men from Minnesota, and there's a reason why they were from Minnesota, and
Okay.
that is Minnesota allows its trial judges to take a year's sabbatical
Wow.
without pay and without pension. They are the only state which at that time allowed that, and as far as I know, they're still the only state that has that provision. In other words, any other judge from any other state who would want to serve on an international court would have to resign in order to do that. So I received a letter from the High Representative, and not just myself, but all the major legal organizations in the country received the same letter. And it asked if there were any judges that we knew of that could come to serve on the court for 2 years. So I circulated that letter to the entire membership of NAWJ, and nobody popped up as wanting to take advantage of this opportunity. And as I say, that wasn't surprising because in order to take advantage of it, they would have had to retire. But as luck would have it, and this is where the magic comes in 2004 was the year which I had to retire because we have mandatory retirement by a certain age in Pennsylvania. And at that time, the mandatory retirement age was 70. And the rule was that you could serve until December 31st of the year in which you became 70. And I would have turned 70, was about to turn 70 on November 3rd of 2004. So I realized that I could take advantage of this offer because I had to retire anyway. And wasn't this wonderful? What if I could serve on an international court? And of course, there were other issues like, you know, what about the fact that my husband had an active law practice in Philadelphia? And also, did I want to actually leave the country for 2
Mm.
years and live somewhere else and somewhere where which I had no idea. I mean, I had visited a lot of countries in Europe as a tourist, but I had never been to Bosnia. But I thought that I would apply anyway and see what happened, and I sent in my resume, and I immediately got a call asking me if I would come and serve for 2 years. I thought about it. I asked them if I could think about it for a weekend and call them back. And, over the weekend, I talked to my husband, and he thought this was a wonderful opportunity for me. My husband was an amazing person and was always immensely supportive of my career and, in fact, came with me to all of the meetings while he was alive. He attended all of the NAWJ and IAWJ meetings with me until the onset of his terminal illness. And he was all for this. He thought it was a good idea. And he said, we'll meet in Europe. When you have a weekend off or time off, I'll meet you in Europe and it'll be wonderful. So, I did go to Washington to meet with a representative from Bosnia, and I agreed, but I said I would only come for 1 year. I wasn't I said, "I'll come for 1 year, and then I'll see if I, am willing to stay for 2," and they agreed to that, and, that's how it came about that I ended up going to Bosnia.
Wow. As you said, sometimes there really is a need to leave space for kind of luck and for the place where you are in your career
Yes,
and
I call it the magic.
the magic.
I've had a lot of magic in my career, and I think you have to leave room for that.
I love that. I love that. And I love that advice that you give to young lawyers as well. I think that's so wonderful to be able to expand their understanding of how they're building out their potential career in the law. Can you just briefly talk about, I know in these experiences that you had on international courts, there were some challenges. I think you've kind of hinted at a little bit already in terms of some of the power dynamics in country, but it'd just be interesting to hear some of the things that
Yeah.
you experienced while you were sitting on those courts.
Well, there were a lot of challenges. First of all, I had to learn, uh, the criminal code of Bosnia, and, I did that before I went. I actually was was due to retire in December, but they wanted me to come earlier than that. So I actually retired in September, and I went over to Bosnia at the beginning of September. And what I found was there's an enormous difference about the way courts operate in Europe from the way they operate in the United States. And I had to adjust to that. But there were some ways in which they operated that I didn't approve of. And so I set about to make changes, and I was able to do that. When I arrived at the court, first of all, it was a hodgepodge. It was half local judges and half international judges from a lot of different countries. And when arrived, there was an Italian judge, a Portuguese judge, 2 Finnish judges, an English judge. I think that was about it. And during the time that I was there, some of the judges left and other judges came, but it was always a hodgepodge of different countries. And, it's really interesting because everybody was paid differently. Everybody was paid by their country, and so it was different than being on a court where everybody's equal and everybody's paid the same. There was also an enormous language problem because the international judges didn't speak English for the most part. I think only one of them, and possibly two, spoke some English. All of the international judges were required to speak and read and write English, but they didn't all do it at the same level. So there were judges on the court who really could not, they could speak and understand English, but they couldn't write English, as we became aware of later when they started writing opinions. And everybody came out of a different tradition, a different legal tradition. And it also turned out that some of the people weren't judges. The big thing I learned about international tribunals is that they rely on countries to send them judges, and the countries don't always send them experienced judges. They sometimes send them people who have never been a judge and have never actually appeared in a courtroom. For instance, they've been academics or they've been in government administration. The only thing that makes them equal is they have a law degree. But other than that, they very often have no experience being a judge. And being a judge is a very special skill. It's not something that you can just walk in one day and do well. It's something that you have to think about and study, and having a lot of courtroom experience as a lawyer is very helpful. But even that isn't enough. And yet, on these international courts, we find people with varying degrees of experience. And I found that I was much more experienced than most of the people who had come to be judges on the court. And as such, I took a leadership position. We had people who had styled themselves the president of the international judges. The Finnish judge got there first, so he decided he was the president of the international judges. Uh, but he didn't know anything about court administration or anything. And my very first day on the court was a Monday. And the very first thing that happened was there was a meeting of what's called in Bosnia the plenum, which we call here the Board of Judges. In other words, it was a meeting of all the judges on the court. So the very first thing I had to do the very first day was to go to this meeting of all the judges on the court. The first order of business was the fact that the president judge of the court had just reached his 70th birthday, which was mandatory retirement in Bosnia. I mean, one of the things that I was happy about was I had reached the mandatory retirement age of my court, but I could still serve on the Bosnia court. And here I'm finding out that in Bosnia, the Bosnian judges actually have a mandatory retirement age of 70, and the chief judge of the court, the president judge, had to retire that day, which was his birthday, I believe. Well, everything is done through an interpreter, which of course makes everything take twice as long. But as it turned out, the Bosnian judges were extremely upset. They really liked this man, and they really liked him being the president judge. I had met him before I came to the court because my husband, wonderful man, had said to me that we should go over to Bosnia before I was going to start to serve on the court and meet the judges and take a look at the court and find a place for me to live and so forth, which was just lovely. So even though I didn't start on the court till September, I had been in Bosnia in Sarajevo in July to meet the judges on the court, and I had met the president judge, and my husband had talked to him, and he had assured my husband that he would take good care of me, and I was impressed with him, and I liked him, and I was really very sad to hear that he was retiring. But the judges on the Bosnian judges didn't want that to happen, and one of the Bosnian judges moved that we should consider that he was on vacation or on sabbatical and not actually retired, because what they were hoping, they could change the mind of the government and, do away with the mandatory retirement age and allow this judge to continue as the president judge of the court. So of course, I voted in favor of that motion because I could see that that was something that the Bosnian judges really wanted to happen. And there was then some more discussion about another issue that I didn't know anything about. And there was then a vote on that. And I had no idea whether a record was being made of the meeting or not, but I said, "If there is a record being made, I'd like the record to show that I'm abstaining because I don't know anything about this issue because I've just come to the court today." And it turned out later that that stood me in very good stead, but it was just by happenstance that I knew enough to do that from my experience, as a judge and as a member of a number of organizations, up to that point. So there were a lot of, challenges, the language challenge, the new law challenge, but also the total lack of administration on the court, since there was no president judge and there was no court administrator at the time, and there was no one doing scheduling and just ordinary things like that. So I let it be known that I thought we needed to have a schedule for the trials, and a lot of the European judges were opposed to that because in a lot of European countries, they don't have contiguous trial days. A case will have a trial hearing one day, and then everybody will get together and decide when the next hearing is. And of course, to me, that sounded really absurd and strange and not a very good and efficient way to do it. So I insisted that we get organized, and we were not able to have contiguous trial days because the lawyers weren't available on contiguous trial days because they were trying cases all over the country in other courts that were scheduling their cases in this sort of haphazard fashion.
Mm.
But I was able to organize it so that every week we met and scheduled the cases for the next 2 weeks, and there was a great need to do this. We had 6 cases at the time. We had 1 court that was only available to us 3 days a week, and when I say to us, that means the international court. The local judges also sat on cases that didn't involve the international judges on other days of the week. So I thought it was really important to have a schedule, and I they put me in charge of it. Nobody else nobody else wanted to do it. So, I did make that difference on the court, but it we sat in tribunals of 3 judges, and very often the other members of the tribunal had no previous judicial experience. And, on the most serious case that I tried, the biggest one, the president there always was one of the judges is the president of the tribunal, was a judge with no previous judicial experience. So he asked me do all the rulings on the evidence, and he asked me we had to do they have guilty pleas in Bosnia, very similar to American guilty plea process, and, of course, he didn't know anything about it. So the very first day of the trial, 4 of the defendants wanted to plead guilty, and he asked me if I knew how to do that, and of course I did. So I was able to do that, and then I was later able to train some of the judges in some of the Bosnian procedure that I was familiar with because it was similar to what we do in the United States. But for instance, in Bosnia law is common law, it's not civil law, and they have things like guilty pleas, the same as we do in the United States. But a lot of the European judges were not only not familiar with the concept of a guilty plea, but they also couldn't accept the concept of a
Mm.
guilty plea. They thought that was wrong, that you had
Mhm.
to have a trial. So there was a lot of educating to do. But I found that challenge one that I very readily accepted. I really enjoyed that. It made being on the court just that much more interesting.
It seems like you, played so many important roles there that were really meaningful, to the both the outcomes and the systems, but also the way that it was important, for the overall outcome.
Well, for the time I was there, you never know how long anything you do lasts. I mean, on my own court in this country, I knew that if I made a change, I knew that it would become part of the system and they would keep it. But on international courts are very different, and you may affect a change for a while, and then it may go back to something else, because the personnel keep changing and the procedure often changes. But that's why I continued working internationally even after I left the court, because I was training judges, in court administration and in what is called case management, which is a skill that all judges have to learn.
Amazing.
That's
Uh,
incredible. I think, this really speaks a lot, I think, to what is really valuable for IAWJ members, right? Thinking about the lessons that we can learn from other countries, from other court systems, thinking about training judges and what can really be brought to bear in terms of best practices, ideas, networking and sharing. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more even about the foundation or formation of IAWJ as we kind of think about this kind of global movement to bring women judges together. And I know that you were part of IAWJ's founding and actually worked with Arlene Pact. And I was wondering if
Yes.
you could maybe share a little bit more about that moment in history or your role and how that came to be.
Well, it was very interesting because IAWJ was modeled after NAWJ. Arlene did it, and she did it on her own. She started it. It was her idea, and she started it. Now, NAWJ started in 1979, and IAWJ started with a very small number of judges coming to San Diego and then had a much bigger conference after that in DC. But it was all Arlene. It was her contacts throughout the globe that started IAWJ. And it was wonderful because, I mean, I have to tell you that NAWJ was incredible. When I became a judge, as I mentioned before my election, along with the other 3 judges that were elected with me, there had only been 5 judges out of 65 judges on the court who were women. And so when we were elected, there were now 9 judges out of 65 judges who were women. But many courts throughout the country had 1 or 2 women judges, maybe some only 1. And what NAWJ did was it gave us a possibility of meeting other women judges and learning from their experiences and getting the warmth of their friendship. And I have to tell you that at my first NAWJ meeting, I'll never forget the feeling that I had when I walked into the ballroom for the banquet and I saw a room with 200 women who were all judges. And I started to cry because it was such an incredible experience to be with that many women, all of whom were judges, and to be able to share with them and to be able to become friends with them. It was incredible. So, what Arlene did was to magnify that and put it on the international level. And I think the friends that I've made through IAWJ, the experiences that I've had visiting all the different countries and learning about the different cultures and learning about different court systems and becoming friends and speaking with the women judges from many different backgrounds have been so enriching for me. And it was all Arlene, though. She did it all. I mean, in the beginning, it was all a concept, and it was her connections that brought the women to the meetings, and she raised the money for to bring people who couldn't afford to come. She was a dynamo. She's a little tiny woman with, and she never tried to be a queen bee, as they're called. I mean, she never tried to appear to be a strong leader, even though she clearly was. But she was a wonderful friend, and she was absolutely delightful and very unassuming, as the truly talented people really are. And she only cared about accomplishing things. She didn't care about glory for herself.
Mm.
And what she did was just amazing. I miss her enormously. I think one of the things I'm most proud of having done is establishing the award in her name that's given out at every biennial conference now. And the first one was given to her at the conference that I chaired in DC in 2016. It was so wonderful to see her being honored and being recognized by everybody for the wonderful work that she did. The work that IAWJ did in rescuing the Afghanistani women judges is such a miracle and would only have happened because of what Arlene started in 1981. Without this organization, there would not have been anywhere for those women to turn. And we know that this is an organization that's very much needed, and it wouldn't be here except for Arlene Pack.
Absolutely. I sadly didn't get to meet her, but I definitely watched her tribute video, and the impact that she made, it is profound, and obviously you getting to work alongside her must have been such a great privilege. And I think just hearing the way that you talk about being, the only woman in your law school class, or maybe one of two, one of a small number of judges on the court in Philadelphia, I think this really is kind of a testament to what we speak about with the Women in Leadership and Law program, right? About like the power of storytelling, the power of networking and camaraderie, and the power of,
Definitely.
yeah,
I mean, in
elevating.
Philadelphia now, there are 45 women judges out of 121. That came about because of organizations like NAWJ and IAWJ, organizations that brought women together and got them to support each other and also taught them a lot about how to do it. We were
Yeah.
able to share our expertise and our knowledge and our experience. And
You
I
know,
was able, for instance, to bring 2 American judges. I had to leave the court in Bosnia after a little over a year because after, I think it was a political matter, but after I got there and I was already 70 that November after I got to Bosnia, and I had a great big birthday party, and I invited all the judges on the court that I knew and everybody, so everybody knew how old I was. Uh, they decided that they decided the international judges should have the same rule as the local judges, so they made a mandatory retirement age for international judges of 70, but I was already 70 when they did that, so they said I could stay until I finished all the cases I was involved in, but I couldn't stay longer than that. So I was able to bring over Shireen Fisher, who I had met through NAWJ, who wrote to me and said she was interested in serving on the court. And I was able to convince them to bring her over to replace me. And then later, we were able to bring Patty Whalen over. So this was all through ties through IAWJ and NAWJ. And this is how we support each other.
Yeah, it seems as though, and you've just seen all the legacy and the importance of those connections. What's interesting also is that you seem to also project this natural, you talked about Arlene, but also yourself and in so much kind of natural leadership. And at one point, obviously, you were president of NAWJ, to just want to understand, why you were inspired to take on that role in addition to, yes, being a judge,
Oh,
but
I just like to be in charge of things. No, I felt that I had vision and that I had leadership ability and that I would like to be in the leadership position in NAWJ. In fact, I was the chair of the State Conference of Trial Judges in 2003 and then president of NAWJ in 2004. So I've had quite a few leadership positions. Uh, now I'm on the BMT, and I was the international director. After being the president of NAWJ, a couple years later, I became the international director, and I served on the international board of IAWJ for a while. And I did try to run for office in IAWJ, but I was defeated.
No. You weren't an
Well,
endorsed
no, what
Democratic
happened was
candidate.
that no, they had an American president. Leslie Alden was the president from the United States. She was a good friend of Arlene's and a big supporter of hers. And she was the president for, I think, 4 years, more than the usual term, because there wasn't really anybody else available to do that job. And she did it very well. But because there had been an American president for so long, they decided they didn't want another American, and I lost out to a Canadian, which was perfectly proper.
very neighborly. I think one of the things that's also really interesting has been the topics that you've been personally, I think, passionate about in all of your work, which I know are women in prison and reforms to that end. What's motivated kind of your longstanding advocacy in this area? I think in human rights in general.
Well, it's very interesting. Just by happenstance, I became a criminal lawyer. When I was in law school, I was told that even though I got amazingly high marks in criminal law subjects, that I could never practice criminal law because women couldn't do that. Because criminal courts were no place for a woman,
Mm.
some language like that. The
Oh.
Supreme Court of the United States, this is what I talk about. You never know what's going to happen. Who could have predicted that in 1963, the Supreme Court of the United States decided the case of Gideon versus Wainwright? And the holding in that case was that anyone accused of a crime was entitled to a lawyer. And if they couldn't afford one, the state had to provide one. And as a result of that, the Defender Association in Philadelphia, which had been providing free lawyers to some people in a small number of cases in the city, had to expand its staff. And they decided they were going to hire 15 more lawyers and they were going to hire one woman. You could do that in those days. You could actually say it out loud. And a friend of mine was the first assistant defender, and he ran into me on the street and said, "We're gonna hire 15 more lawyers, we're gonna hire one woman, and you should apply for the job." And, I thought about it and thought it sounded really interesting because I've always been a performer. I was a professional dancer before I became a lawyer, and I always loved being on stage and performing, and to me, the courtroom is the stage of, uh, law practice, and
It's a
so
theater.
the opportunity to be a trial lawyer looked pretty good. So I did apply for the job and I got it. And that started my career in criminal law. And as a result of being like the first woman in Philadelphia to actually practice criminal law on a regular basis, I ended up being very involved in legal issues, in criminal legal issues, and among other things, to my shock and surprise, I found out that the sentencing laws of Pennsylvania discriminated against women, and that as a result of the law, and I won't go into the details now because that's a whole other speech, women got longer sentences than men. I'll just briefly say men could be sentenced to anything up to the maximum sentence for the crime, but women had to be sentenced to the maximum. And as a result, women were serving much longer sentences than men, which sounds like the opposite of what should be the fact, right? But that law had been on the books since 1932, and it hadn't bothered anybody till I came along. So First of all, that proves why you need women because why you need diversity in every profession because the men weren't bothered by that. And it took a woman to be bothered. And I decided that I was going to attack the constitutionality of the law. And I did. I did it successfully. But that put me in touch with women who were in prison and with their problems, which go far beyond just how much of a sentence they get, but also the conditions of the prisons and whether they're appropriate, whether they have appropriate programming, and so forth and so on. And I found that women were being discriminated against, women in prison, in many different ways because there were so few of them compared to men. And I know this sounds odd, but it turns out that if you're applying for a grant, that it's easier to get a grant that serves a great number of people, or at least it was in those days, than a smaller number of people. There used to be something in the early '70s called the LEAA, the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, a part of the United States government and part of the Justice Department. And you know that if you could write a grant with some kind of idea about a program for a criminal, population, you could get money, and I found that most of the money was being spent on men, and that was because women were this is the term, statistically insignificant.
Wow.
Wow.
Yep. When I brought it up at a meeting of the parole board and said, "I don't hear anything about programs for women," I was told, "That's because women are statistically insignificant, so it's easier to get a grant for men because there are so many of them," which seems backwards, but that may be the true picture. So I became interested in what I could do for women in prison. And over the years, I participated in a lot of different efforts to improve both what happens in prison for women and what happens when they get out on parole. And that effort still has to continue. And there are many countries that do a very good job of providing meaningful incarceration for women, but there are a lot of countries that do a very bad job. And one of the things I'd love to see IAWJ do is to have a global conference where we bring together all the countries that do it right, and all the countries that do it wrong, and share information so that maybe we can get the countries that do it wrong, like the United States for the most part, to learn from the countries that do it right, like, among other things, Qatar, the Netherlands, Denmark, places like that. Anyway, that's a dream I have.
I think you're right about many of our members and different associations globally have tremendous concerns about this issue. And I've also had a chance to visit some prisons in Malawi and in the States with our members. It's been really
Mostly what NAWJ has done with its Committee on Prisoners is to have a prison visit every time there's a conference, but that's not enough, and it's not enough to collect tampons and things like that for prisoners. I mean, we really have to learn how to get involved in the prison administration business and how to have an influence on the way women are treated in prison and the kind of rehabilitation that's offered for them and also for their children. I mean, what was true many years ago is still true that, first of all, like in Pennsylvania, there are two women's prisons. One of them is 3 hours from Philadelphia, and the other I'm talking about state penitentiaries. There is, of course, the local jail, but I'm not talking about that. That's another problem. But the state penitentiary, both of them are too far from Philadelphia for the women to get visitors, and the reason is when a man goes to prison, he has a whole bunch of support. He has his mother, his aunts, his girlfriend, his wife. When a woman goes to prison, her mother and her aunts or her grandmother are home taking care of her kids
yeah.
and that she has to leave behind. So she doesn't get visits and she doesn't get, comfort packages. And it's a whole different experience. And this is still true. That was true many years ago, and it's still true in most women's prisons.
I think that speaks a lot to kind of what you were talking about in terms of just the role of judges in the administration of justice for, throughout the entire ecosystem, right? Like from bench to advocating for what happens to people within these systems as well, and thinking about access to justice and the role that judges have to play in creating an ecosystem that really reflects, what actually happens to people in these systems.
It's true, and we really have to encourage people to get involved. That's why we have to encourage membership in organizations like NAWJ, IAWJ, the ABA, and other national organizations. I was very lucky to have a close friend, a woman I had met in law school. She was about 5 years older than me, and she was a graduate student when in law school when I was there as a student, and we became friends. And she later became a judge. And when I became a judge, she took me out to lunch and said, "You have to join NAWJ." She was one of the founding members of NAWJ. "And you have to join the ABA and you have to get active and go to the meetings." And as a result of that, I did. And I think it's a lot, there are a lot of, because there are so many more women judges now on the local courts, a lot of women don't feel that they need NAWJ
Mhm.
or IAWJ, and they're wrong because they really need to be involved in the administration of the courts, like what's happening both locally and on a global level and on the national level. It's really important. It's important to belong to these overarching organizations and to be active.
I think that segues really nicely on to, the role of judges today, right? Obviously, the demographics have changed not only in the United States, but in countries around the world, and you are seeing an increase, but the need for and the space for associations is still very much great. And we're still seeing through our Women in Leadership and Law program that, women are still not reaching the same rate the top levels of the judiciary. So, how do you see the role of judges evolving in today's world? And I think particularly within a lens of, global threats to both judicial independence, gender equality issues.
Well, I just think judges have to get involved. They have to, it's very easy as a judge. It's a wonderful job and it's very engrossing. It's very intellectually stimulating, and it also is very ego fulfilling. You go in the courtroom, everybody has to stand up, and you're in charge, and you have an awesome authority. And it's easy to just go to your job and go home. And it's also, we all have, usually at our younger age, we have young children. It's very fulfilling our life. We have a family life, and we have our work, and we don't feel like we have to reach out and go higher and belong to these overarching organizations. But I think that's our job, is we have to tell judges that we have to be involved. We have to be involved in our communities, and we have to be involved in the development of the law and the protection of the Constitution and individual rights. And that is very important. And for that reason, it becomes even more important to share with people from different places in the world, from different places in the country, to know what's going on everywhere and to share our knowledge and to share our experience.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. I think sometimes we don't really drive home the importance of women telling their stories and other people raising the visibility and elevating those stories, but it's so critical to understanding experiences and being able to determine where we can have impact.
I agree. And as a retired judge, I feel it's my responsibility to share my experience with younger judges and share my thoughts on what I think is important about being a judge and what I think it's important for judges to do. They may not accept it, but I think it's important for those of us who are older and have a broader perspective. I mean, I graduated law school 67 years ago. So it's a long tour, and, I think it's my obligation to share my experience, and I try to do that.
We thank you for that. And we're so grateful to have your voice in all of this.
Yes.
Uh,
But I should also say that I'm also up for adventure. So I
Aren't we
I'm
all?
not I'm
Yes.
not totally focused on the past. I am very much up for what's happening tomorrow, what's happening now, and, uh, where can I be effective?
I think it's exciting to hear your legacy, but it's ongoing, right? Um,
Well, my life is ongoing, and, whether I'll have a legacy or not, I that will be for other generations to decide, but, I won't be here to experience that. But I just think it's really important to be involved and to keep involved throughout your life. That's, something that my friend taught me and that I think it's important, especially for women, because we have so many responsibilities. Because, despite women's lib and all that came after that, women still have, in many places, the major responsibility for the children and the major responsibility for, buying the food and running the home and all of that. And I think it's easy to say, "This is enough. I'm doing enough." And I think it's really important that people like me are there to say, "No, it's not enough. You need to go beyond." And it will help you, and it will help you do your day-to-day duties as well and put them in perspective.
well, Judge Temin, we like to close by asking all of our guests, as you may know, one question, and that is in one word, what do you think will have the greatest impact on advancing women's leadership in law?
Our energy.
Absolutely. And I think you really brought the energy today, and we're just so grateful for this conversation and indeed the legacy that you will leave for others and what the work that you're continuing to do is incredibly inspirational. And we're so grateful for your work at NAWJ and, of course, your ongoing work at IWJ. We want to thank you again for joining us today and sharing your incredible journey through law and the judiciary. Your trailblazing career and steadfast commitment to justice have left a lasting mark on both NAWJ and the IAWJ, and your leadership and mentorship and unwavering advocacy for the protection of women, especially those most vulnerable to violence and discrimination, has really helped shape a more inclusive and equitable legal system. And again, we're just so deeply grateful for your contributions and your continued inspiration to judges around the world. So thank you for
Thank you,
joining.
thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you for tuning into Justice Beyond the Bench. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Want to learn more about our work and support our mission? Visit us at iawj.org, where you can explore our programs, join our global network, or make a donation to help advance gender equity in judiciaries around the world. See you next time.